Learning ancient languages, is it worth it? On this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. One of our viewers asked the question, is it worth it to learn ancient Egyptian? I'm here with my producer, Kiara, who's off screen.
Hello.
She has also learned some ancient languages. And we're here today just to have a little conversation to discuss, is it worth it to learn an ancient language? Now, I know languages because I have to know them professionally. I'm an Egyptologist and a Bible scholar. So for me, I have to know ancient Egyptian, Hebrew, Greek, some other minor Semitic languages, Akkadian, those sorts of things. But Kiara isn't an expert on the ancient Near East, and yet she's decided that she wanted to learn some other languages.
Well, even when you're doing it for personal reasons, it really enriches your life. Plus, it lets you know if the translation you're reading is accurate or not.
Mm-hmm.
So, David, how much do you feel translations are influenced by the translator versus kind of a more sterile one-to-one, word for word?
More often than I would care to admit. The fact is that one of the biggest tasks I do with ancient languages is translation verification. I'll often get somebody who comes up to me and says, "Hey, David, we encountered this translation. Is this translation accurate because of what it implies?" And I'll look at the translation and I'll say to myself, well, let's go back to the original primary source and find out. So I'll go back and I'll look at the primary source and I'll say, no, that's not there. That's something that the translator added to embellish it or smooth it or do something else with the translation. So I often find that translations don't actually match with the original primary source.
How much of that involves the fact that we live in the 21st century and we have a completely, radically different cultural context to what they lived through in the ancient Near East?
Well, that is true that context does play a huge role in translations. For example, many of, say, the older translations of, say, the Book of the Dead or the Coffin texts were actually translated by gentlemen who were much more influenced by the Bible. So they'll often add a biblical kind of translation over top of the Egyptian texts. And so you do get some of these translations that are a little bit hinky because they're importing concepts into their translation that's not in the original cultural context.
So even reading for fun, reading for personal pleasure, you'd still recommend people learn the original language?
Well, it does give a depth and a richness to what you're reading. Because sometimes you'll see, words and phrases in a translation that you will recognize from the learning the language that imports extra meaning and emotion to it. Like, for example, you'll read in a common thing you'll read, say, in Egyptian texts is, you'll come across a name and then it'll say justified. Well, justified after a name comes from the Egyptian ma'aheru, true of voice. It means the person's dead. And he can no longer lie. He's got a true voice. It's his true self now. So now you go along and you read this and you say, okay, this is now talking about the person after their death, after they've died.
And you definitely would not get that from a 21st century modern translation of that.
No, you wouldn't, because justify doesn't tell you as much.
Yeah, you would think you were talking about a living person whose statements have been gone through a fact checker if the fact checker were in fact a truthsayer.
Yeah, even if you had known already that that person was dead at the time of the writing, you would still have to say, well, what does this mean? What is the cultural implications of all this? So by knowing the original languages, you get all that extra cultural information poured into what you're reading.
Similar analogy would be like knowing Old English and reading Shakespeare and understanding. Shakespeare's much, much funnier if you know what Old English is, if you're not just trying to do a modern interpretation.
Right.
What would you say the level of needing? We're talking about, is it worth it?
Yes.
And you've stated you need it because you speak at a professional level. So for somebody who's considering becoming a professional, what level would you say they need it? It's a benefit, or it's just optional?
It depends on what your professional practice is going to be. Now, I would say, for example, if you are going to become, say, a Bible scholar, do you need ancient Egyptian? Probably not. Translations might suffice, or consulting with an Egyptologist might suffice, somebody who knows the language, if you've got those personal connections already. But if you're an Egyptologist, oh yeah, you need it. You're not even considered to be a professional Egyptologist without 4 years of language study in ancient Egyptian. Every field sort of has its tiers of competency. Would you be considered a Bible scholar if you didn't know Hebrew and Greek? Probably not. And the fact is, if you're even a pastor and you don't know Hebrew and Greek, that really limits what sort of depth you can get out of the biblical text.
But you and I have both experienced that. Sitting in the pews listening to various individuals, we have both turned to each other and says, he doesn't know Hebrew. He Googled that translation.
Yes. And that's one of the things about learning an ancient language is you can tell if a translation is really hinky, because there's a way any language sort of thinks and has concepts. Like, for example, there's a song, Home, Home on the Range, that's not translatable into French, because French does not have a concept of home. It has a concept of house, like our house, chez nous, but not a concept of being home.
And anybody who's had to move knows when you move your new house or your new apartment, it takes a long time for that to be home.
Yes.
There's a definite difference.
Yeah, there's a definite difference between house and home. But it's a concept that's absent from French. There's also these concepts that are absent in ancient languages. Like, for example, if I say, we went to the market, all of us. All of us would not be a usage that you would find in ancient Egyptian. Because all was never used like that as sort of an equivalent group pronoun. You would have all items, but you wouldn't have, say, all of us. It was never used in that way. So when you encounter a translation that uses, say, hinky language like that, it sort of red flags you that, well, ancient people or modern languages didn't use certain concepts in certain ways. And those give you red flags when you read a translation.
So for somebody simply wanting to read on a personal level, what would you say is the benefit of taking the time and discipline? Because it does require.
It does require time and discipline. And it also is going to depend upon which language you want to look at. Because there are some languages that don't have translations or don't have many translations, like ancient Hittite. If you want to read ancient Hittite text, you really have little choice other than to learn the ancient language because there's so few translations available. On the other hand, in ancient Egyptian, there's a lot of translations available, but you still may want to learn it to say, okay, weigh if a translation is a good translation or a bad translation. Or if you want more depth out of the text. For example, the Egyptians used amphibole a lot, poetic language that did reference two things at once. You're not going to get that nuance out of a translation.
Poetry generally doesn't translate well between languages.
Poetry is always a challenge. It's always a challenge in any language.
So I know you get the question. It's not really a question. People simply say to you, because you know 13 languages, oh, this must be easy for you.
Yeah, no. If anything, languages have been a matter of blood, sweat, and tears for me. Languages have been exceptionally difficult for me to pick up. I don't have a gift for languages, even though I've managed to learn a lot of them. It's just that I've needed to learn a lot of them. So, necessity forces you sometimes to pick up a lot of things. But at the same time, too, I don't think that there's a lot these days preventing people from picking up languages. Language training has never been more available. The resources have never been better. There's never been easier ways to learn languages.
So what would you recommend the first foreign language be for somebody who really wants to get into other languages, whether ancient or modern?
Wow. It really depends on what their focus is. If they want to, there's an old quip by William F. Albright. The most important Semitic language is German. And really why he's saying that is because a lot of biblical literature back in his day was primarily written in German. And German still remains an important scholarly language. Not as important as it once was, but it's still really important.
And if anybody listening to this YouTube right now is in high school or junior high, take those languages in junior high and high school. It is much, much harder to learn them as an adult.
It will save you agony in the long run, that's true. I didn't learn German in high school, I only learned French. But for me, it did save me agony in the long run, I have to admit. But if you want to learn about the Bible, Hebrew is a really good language to start with, even though a lot of people start with Greek because of the New Testament. Greek is actually a more difficult language, even though the alphabet's more similar to our own.
So what we've seen is people who take one semester, maybe 2 semesters of a language. Do you feel that makes them qualified to say they're competent in a language?
No, it doesn't. I'll say this. If you've taken 2 semesters of Greek, you know just enough Greek to be dangerous. Okay?
Amplify that.
Well, the fact is that Greek has a lot of nasty nuances and exegetical traps. Like, for example, you'll get through first year Greek and thinking, oh, the genitive is so easy. By the third year Greek, you go, the genitive is so hard. because there's so many different possible readings of the genitive, and only one is right.
So this would be a reason for starting to learn languages early, is you learn things, not just vocabulary, but concepts like what a genitive is.
Yeah. Greek has two really nasty tricks, the genitive and the participle. Both of those are really, really nasty because they are so, the meanings can differ so widely unless you have really studied how the language works.
So do you think our cousins across the pond have an advantage because they learned Latin?
Oh, they definitely have an advantage because they've learned English through the learning of Latin. So, knowing how English works, they learn stuff such as the genitive, the nominative, the accusative, these sorts of how language works through the learning of Latin. We don't have that advantage in North America because Latin is rarely taught in North America, which is unfortunate because our language acquisition would be a lot easier if we did. So, was it worth it for you to learn ancient languages?
It has been a lot of fun, but as you've said, it's also helped me be able to determine for myself, is this a good translation or a bad translation?
I think learning ancient languages is definitely worth it. If just for personal interest, if you're doing it professionally, it's a necessity. For your personal interest, it is definitely still worthwhile.
And if you're actually writing a paper or doing something public, I would highly recommend, if you're not an expert, check with one so you don't embarrass yourself.
And with that said, we'll wrap this up. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible, and thank you very much for coming on. See you next time.